Angie Peacock. I'm a female veteran, a psychiatric drug withdrawal consultant, and a healing coach. I enjoy bringing important conversations that interest me to you. Today, we are speaking with United States Air Force retired Staff Sergeant Colleen Bushnell. Hello, Colleen.
Hi, Angela. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Colleen and I have been running in the same circle for like probably 15 years. We've never actually sat down and talked until recently, when I was just like, I want to hear about the state of the MST community. MST is going to be a word you're going to, or what did we call the acronym you're going to hear like throughout this conversation. MST stands for military sexual trauma. So that includes like rape, sexual harassment, things like that. But we've been running in that community for years and years and years. So I've always admired her work, her advocacy, her fierce determination. So I wanted to bring you her story and just kind of talk with her, and you can witness what we have to say. So without further ado, let me read her bio so you'll know a little about her. Retired Staff Sergeant Colleen Bushnell has been a leading national advocate for military justice policy reform since 2011. Colleen is a New York native and OIF/OEF veteran who was a public affairs specialist and trainer. Colleen's supervisor and commander assaulted her in 2003 while she served at Lackland Air Force Base, media relations manager. Subsequently, with no prior psychiatric history at age 31 and no crime victim services to speak of, military doctors diagnosed Colleen with a personality disorder and prescribed Colleen a psychotropic medication cocktail. Amidst severe retaliation for reporting her commander's attack spanning 3 military bases, Colleen overdosed 3 times, rendering her in a coma in 2008. A civilian doctor that year advised Colleen to cease taking psychiatric drugs due to her severe reactions. In 2018, genetic testing affirmed that Colleen was indeed sensitive to many of the medicines prescribed. Colleen's reform activism began in 2012 when Colleen cycled across the country, sharing her story to compel congressional hearings into sexual abuses at Lackland Air Force Base basic training. Now, after major legislative reform reshaping the military justice system, Colleen speaks about the impact the multiple systemic failures had on her health and her family. Part of her story is being featured in a new PBS series called After Action, and we'll bring that up again a few times. So go ahead and bookmark the page, pbs.org, search for After Action, and you'll see when her episode airs. When does it air?
January 9th.
January 9th. So make sure you catch that. It's so important. It's on pbs.org, and just enter your zip code and you'll see your local listing. All right, so let's jump right in. First of all, I have so many, your story is horrific, obviously, and I've heard it over and over about personality disorder. You know, a female gets assaulted, males too, obviously, but that's the diagnosis they give you, as if there's something wrong with you, but you're the one that was assaulted. And it just turns my stomach every time I hear that. So I guess, can you say a few words about that, like diagnosis after a trauma?
Well, yeah, a word that I hadn't been familiar with prior to these experiences would be pathologizing. I didn't know what pathologizing meant. And I came to learn that the DSM is basically used to label and categorize what I consider industrialize the movement of people through the psychiatric system.
Yeah.
So I learned from my experiences in the Air Force how the military was applying the DSM in my personal situation, but uniquely, my mother had some psychiatric problems when I was a child, and I was kind of an adult at a young age. So I had more knowledge than the average on at least what it's like to be around someone with psychiatric issues and psychiatric medicine and how it was affecting my mom. So when I became a crime victim and the system attempted to pathologize me, I was less than unaware that something was wrong. I knew something was wrong, that it wasn't in my best interest. I didn't think it was in the military's best interest either. I felt they were losing a really strong troop who had a bright future and was dedicated, and evidence was in my track record. So I knew right away that something was wrong with what I was being told and how I was being treated after my horrific ordeal.
Yeah. And I mean, I can totally relate to that, but you had this intuition, like something is wrong here. Like, wait a minute, I didn't do anything wrong. Why am, you know what I mean? Like that intuition
All of a
about,
sudden, my life went from reality to what I call now the Twilight Zone years. Obviously, that started with my attack at Lackland, the first one. So in any event, when I started filling out questionnaires and I was being told I was probably bipolar like my mother and what have you, I just knew something was wrong, because I knew my mother, the issues my mother had when I was a child, she didn't still have. My mother has disabilities, but in the psychiatric sense, she wasn't taking heavy psychiatric drugs anymore. So obviously, if someone has a severe psychiatric illness, they're not able to thrive at work or function without proper medication. And I knew that that was just a short window in her life. And this was the first time in my life at 30 years old that all of a sudden I was being told I had mental illness. So
yeah. Yeah, so let's go back a little bit. Can you share a little bit about, like, whatever you feel comfortable with, like what happened in the military and kind of how that led you to be a military justice reform advocate?
well, my story, I've not spoken about my entire story because I really needed to do some research, experience some problem solving in several of the areas. I call it the domino effect that happened beginning in 2003. So I waited a long time. Even after I became an advocate for military justice policy reform, I was concerned that if I spoke about my entire story, it might endanger my children. And there was loss of life involved. So I felt pretty sensitive about any impact I might have on the individuals whose lives were lost. So I think at this point, I'm wanting to talk about or show the public the number of systemic failures that were put upon me from 2003 until today, actually, because I want them to understand that there are other women out there like me right now, active duty in the military. I've done my due diligence for 13 years as an advocate. I've met other women like me who are much younger with lots less life experience, single mothers who've been attacked, and the aftermath that they suffered, which was parallel to what I suffered. So I started to see patterns, and I wanted that affirmation. I didn't want to go to the public and say anything that I didn't think was more beyond just my particular circumstance. And to say that that burden has been met for me on many fronts in my story and within the movement would be an understatement. And I'm honestly, it's a little bit of a mystery to me as to why I was able to step outside of my circumstances so often, fall down and get back up. I can only credit that to a higher power because it's beyond my own understanding. So with that being said, so there are several systems that affected me, and it began with obviously military law enforcement, and then it moves on to military mental health, and then it moves on to the benefits system, and then the family court system when after I got out. But very quickly, let me just tell my MST story, just to kind of give a foundation. I was 30 years old. I walked into Lackland Air Force Base Public Affairs, one of the largest public affairs offices in the Air Force. And I had done very well at my previous 2 assignments. I believe that's why I was chosen to work at a showcase base. But I had gone through a divorce. My ex-husband was a combat veteran, and we had 2 young children. So when I arrived at Lackland, I was by myself, single parenting for the first time. And when I got there, immediately I noticed that it was unpopular, which wasn't characteristic for me. And long story short, I had an airman who I felt a GS, senior GS employee on our staff was being inappropriate with. And I decided to bring our commander into awares about it, and not deal with it myself, but hand it to leadership and, stay in my lane. But it was around that time that I became unpopular. It turns out that my commander, and I didn't know this for a good year, claimed that she had been raped by this GS civilian who is now her employee 12 years earlier. And there was a battle going on between them with the commander of the base's office to try to get her some help, but she was not able to. So they would fight constantly. He was very disrespectful of her authority and probably felt indignant that he had to work for her, I would guess. Mm-hmm. In any event, I didn't know they had that history. She didn't tell me. And she told him that I went to her about this airman. And that scared him because he was already being scrutinized as she was seeking help from what he had done to her. I later found out that not only did he rape her, but that she became pregnant, suffered an abortion, and her husband left her. They were both pilots. So she had some severe trauma on board, and her perpetrator was in the office harassing her, basically. So he took me to a base hotel under a false premise on a day when I was very upset about a personal family problem, and he attacked me. And I didn't tell because I had seen the sway he held over her and the group commanders, and how true the sway was at that, young time in my life as an E5, a staff sergeant, I don't know, but definitely he painted a picture that he would triangulate all different base functions against each other to get some sort of control or leadership, informal leadership advantage. Mm-hmm. So I didn't tell on him. I was frightened that he would kill me. He physically abused me during that time and made it clear to me that he had taken life in his military career, and even used some scare tactics with me throughout the ordeal in other ways, including threatening me with a gun. So fast forward a year, I don't know that she has told him this or that's why this is happening to me. And I volunteered to deploy to get away. And I come back, and my commander and I are at a happy hour for Air Force Public Affairs conference in San Antonio. And my commander was very drunk and in uniform. We were all in civilian clothes, and she became unruly and took off her uniform in public. So I instinctively, being her only staff member, got a security guard to take us to her room to get her out of the public eye. And once we got in the room, she was more out of control and sexually assaulted me. So I, at that point, was distraught, confused, reflective, and I left. I made a way to end the situation and leave the room. And the very next morning, I went and reported what happened to the Area Defense Council, because at that time there were no attorneys for crime victims. But I did the right thing. Immediately I was being called and threatened with AWOL for not coming to the office, which base leadership was able to witness. They had me at that point in their custody. And then they put me and my sons in hiding because they were concerned for our welfare. I don't remember exactly whether it was 24 or 48 hours later, I was told that she had taken her life in her home. so that began the domino effect from my MST with my 2 children. Right after that, I was informed that I might be charged with homosexual misconduct because the UCMJ had not been reformed, if you will, to account for same gender sexual interaction that was occurring during a crime. So if I admit that anything occurred, I'm admitting to already breaking the law on its face until that person is found guilty of a crime. But that I was able to evade that with my attorney. And part of the reason was my reputation was so good that they believed my story. But what didn't happen, a lot of folks ask me, why didn't I tell on him, but I told on her? Number one, I wanted her to get help. I did not dislike our commander. She was a lovely human being who was troubled, but just a kind soul. Right. Number two, I fully expected law enforcement to ask me about this man because he was present at the conference when she fell apart. The base knew about the history between them, and I was so junior ranking. I just assumed that they would want to look further into it. But if they didn't, I had enough life experience and military experience to know that it may not be safe for me to add an element to this on the Air Force side. And I definitely knew that I was going to jeopardize my own safety by telling, knowing that law enforcement is reactive. They cannot apprehend people or violate their rights, without due diligence. So there was going to be a gap between what I had to say about him and their response. And I was genuinely afraid that he would murder me, especially once she had taken her life. And he forced me to take him to the Area Defense Council so they could affirm to him that I had not reported him for anything. So he was working his psychopath or sociopathic machinations the whole time. As a matter of fact, during the time I knew him, I got the book from the library, The Sociopath Next Door, because I knew what was happening to me and I needed to understand what I was dealing with. So that was my ordeal at Lackland. And then I was transferred to teach, which was already at play, but they sent me on to teach public affairs at the Defense Information School in the DC area. When I got there, the deputy commandant told me right away that he was not pleased with my presence, which upset me because I knew they didn't know the whole story. I felt I was still in danger. And because this was a senior ranking, executive manager making statements to me far above my pay grade, and I could see it involved probably some politics and what have you. So it was frightening, and I was retaliated against immediately. And my children's welfare was then in jeopardy as my coworkers started to view me as an unfit parent for no good reason other than retaliation, which I now know as a subject matter expert what that was about. And so then I was put on medicines, and that's when I became suicidal. And I had never been suicidal in my life. I had pretty significant childhood trauma, but I was quite the overcomer. So when I became suicidal, it did not make sense to me. I wasn't an impulsive person. And so they end up transferring me to down the road to Bolling Air Force Base to work for a Pentagon support unit, while my advocates or allies in the Pentagon were fighting with my supervisors at the Defense Information School. Literally, I was told one of the first sergeants threatened my supervisor at DIFOS for the way they were treating me, who was a Navy personnel. So it was just absolutely frightening. I spent time at Walter Reed psychiatric ward I was verbally attacked by a psychiatrist who was testing my mettle, perhaps to see if I was malingering, as crazy as that sounds.
Yep.
So this was like something out of a Hollywood movie happening to me. And I couldn't even explain to my family. My friends and I were separated from each other. While I was, so they couldn't be helpful to me because they really didn't know my life anymore, which is very typical of any service member who's been away. Then while I'm at bowling, we get a phone call from a journalist. By then I had hired a lawyer, a high profile lawyer, because I knew from Lackland court marshals who the heavy hitters were. And I had called his office and one of his colleagues became my lawyer. And in the meantime, I get a phone call from a journalist who wanted to know if I had any knowledge about the death of Dr. Shu, who was a Lackland psychiatrist who was murdered, I believe it was in 2004. Yeah. And it was an unsolved mystery. And I had no knowledge, but obviously that was frightening. I didn't respond at my attorney's advice, which I felt bad about because I knew my commander's family were grieving. But at the same time, we didn't answer that query. I'm being retaliated against at bowling now. I had performed really well in the first ever Joint Anti-Terrorism Task Force in DC. Then, nominated or given an award, and was literally taken after it was announced for no reason other than the fact that I was there under duress as a crime victim. Mm-hmm. So I was asked to do a suicide prevention briefing for the wing staff. So they wanted me to then educate them as if to blame me for my commander's death. And I couldn't come to work. I created the presentation, but I couldn't come to work. And then my supervisors attempted to press charges against me for dereliction of duty for not being able to get out of bed. So I was not safe at any of these locations. And then this issue of personality disorder came up, and right away I knew enough to know I was being railroaded. And that's my lawyer helped me with that. So that's the military piece.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, is it like the minute you call attention to something happening, which was MST or, sexual trauma, and then you get a diagnosis, boom, you're thrown away. Like, we don't want to hear anything about you. We don't want you to come to work. Like, we don't even want you here. Everything you say is, you know what I mean? Like, explain that.
Right. Well, because mission first. And systems, especially in the military, are built basically to eliminate the need to decide on conscience. They want to systematize as many decisions as they can so that business can proceed. And they have so much power that they're exceedingly effective at systematizing people and the mission. So the DSM is constructed to pretty much marry with that ideology.
Good point.
It's there to help them label, sort, and shuffle people along.
God, ain't that the truth?
Even though it's based on very little science, which I can talk about later on, how I came to understand the DSM in more depth. I'm going to take a note so I don't forget.
Yeah, but let me share a little bit about me right there, because that's exactly what happened to me. A year prior to you, or that mine happened in 2004 after I got home from Iraq. But my own story really quickly was military sexual trauma in 2001. I recovered from it. Same as you. I tried to tell, they didn't want to hear it. I didn't seek treatment. I got support from my friends, and that's how I got through it. I re-enlisted. I got the hell out of there, just like you. It was that fight or flight. Like, I got to get out of here. I don't want to see this guy ever again. And then I went to combat in 2003. And then when I came home is when I got that diagnosis. And I remember thinking, how did I go from like amazing soldier, top of my game, running faster than some of the guys, winning boards, winning NCO of the year. I was runner up NCO of the year for 1st Armored Division, like a unit of 5,000 men. I'm runner up. And I know I didn't get it because I was a female. And they said, here's a coffee cup. Thanks a lot. But anyway, like, how did I go from that to like, you're mentally ill and we don't want you anymore? And you're a piece of shit in one day. And that was all because of a diagnosis and because I sought help. And to me, that is the worst decision I have ever made, was to go get help. You know, I know that's controversial. I know people don't want to hear that, but I'm telling you, it ruined my fucking career. It ruined my life. It ruined my marriage at the time, everything, because I sought that. But your point that the minute you call
Sought legal or mental health help?
mental health,
Which
mental.
it wasn't the legal issue of reporting the crime.
No, my legal side was, I told my platoon sergeant, and he basically said, look, the way the system is set up is you're going to go to trial. They're going to make you look like a party girl and that you were drinking and you did something to provoke it. He's going to get transferred to another base. He won't lose a rank because he's a staff sergeant. You will get chaptered out. Is that what you want? And I said, no, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything. I'm retelling you what happened to me. And then he said, okay, well, if you don't want to go through with that, then this conversation never happened. And that was my reporting in 01. And so then I was like, what am I supposed to do? I don't want to lose my career. I didn't do anything. So I just had to find a way to cope. So that was go to PLDC, which is to become a sergeant for people listening that are civilians. It's a school that you go to for a month. So I was like, that'll get me out of this base immediately. You know, number two, I re-enlisted for Germany and tried to get out of there as fast as I could. And then I had all my friends tell him, if you don't leave her alone, she's going to tell and you're going to be in trouble. And it was like, I was protected. I call it my football team. All the guys kind of got around me and like, leave her alone. Don't even look at her, you know? That was the only way I could deal with it, because I didn't want to go through with the reporting at that time. But the thing that upsets me the most, Colleen, and I'm sure you feel the same, is, you know, this is 20 years now. I've watched more and more MST victims, male and female. And I think the numbers are, there's actually more crimes against males than females by sheer numbers. But the percentage of like female is like 30% that get assaulted. And it's classified by OSHA as a military sexual trauma is a occupational hazard if you join the military. Like, this continues like for 20 years. And I've, just like you, I've been on CBS News, NBC Nightly News, MSNBC, Wounded Warrior Project, sitting on Capitol Hill, going to VFW conferences, talking about this shit for 20 years. And what happens? People get assaulted, they get labeled by the mental health establishment, they get medicated, they become suicidal, they're in and out of the doors, the same shit over and over. I'm sick of it. I'm sorry for cursing so much, but I'm just that sick of it.
I understand. I do. I definitely empathize. It's been quite an education for me, you know, since this happened and I became an activist. But I, you know, also I failed to mention, I did send my children away to protect them. And someone had put something in my gas tank and destroyed my 2-year-old Toyota SUV. And then I was evicted from my apartment because one of my peers was my landlord in the office. So just to add like a layer on top of what I've already said, when you talk about, before I get on to the veteran side, once I retire, because this domino effect continues, I wanted to say that I understand your point of view about wanting to stay, and the different, there's got the mental health kind of problem, and then the law enforcement issue and the reporting. I think it's fair to say the retaliation happened because of both. And I'm going to share an opinion later that I've never shared, but I'm leaning toward what I think is most ethical at this point in this movement, knowing how long policy takes, first of all, to change and then implement and then watch over to ensure that it's being followed through on. I think that we might need to have a discussion about advising MST survivors to get out as fast as they can when they are attacked, and the means they can use to do that. I don't discourage people necessarily from enlisting in the military, because not everyone is going to get attacked. No. Yeah. Statistically, you're more likely to not get attacked. However, if you do get attacked, I'm at this point, with all of the work I've done and reflecting and talking to different policymakers and stakeholders, to me, the most ethical thing to say as an advocate at this point is to get that family member out of the military as soon as possible to preserve their health, because their health is the only thing that individual is going to have to be able to rise out of whatever happened. And it's also going to mitigate retaliation if they take certain steps to get out, and bring eyes on their case immediately. But we can revisit that a little later as I take this next step to explain how what happened when I get out. I get out and my family doesn't understand what's happened. They really don't know me anymore. We had plenty of family trauma history with divorce in the family and things that a lot of families never resolve. And they didn't necessarily come to my aid. And I floundered. And because I applied for VA benefits and I wasn't given enough, I wasn't able to get my children. That's been changed. I believe President Obama changed the law in the middle of my time as an advocate, thankfully, so that now if you are injured in the military or attacked, they're doing your VA claims while you're in. And that in and of itself has saved countless lives, I have no doubt. So I'm glad that that has changed. But when I got out in 2006, I didn't have that kind of help. And they put on my DD 214 that my disability was temporary. I believe that was a red flag on my form that is recognized in the VA system and prompts raters and claims processors to scrutinize your package. So what happened was I didn't get unemployability, which I clearly needed. I was on so many drugs, even after I overdosed, and I couldn't function. My children were being now kept from me. And I was homeless. I was literally homeless. The day I was discharged, there was no, retirement ceremony. I was too distraught to financially plan. And I went from active duty to a homeless shelter down the street from the Pentagon. So then I have the task of deciding my future, not knowing how bad off I am, and decide to rent a home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, to keep myself in proximity to DC, thinking perhaps I could, go into public affairs as a civilian. And I bring my children with me. At this point, their father is trying to manipulate custody-wise, and he stops paying child support. So I'm only making $1,400 a month, and my ex-husband stops child support. And I have my children, and I'm on all these drugs, and my family isn't helping me. I don't have a partner. And so as time ticked away and I couldn't pay my bills, I became despondent, and I was on Seroquel, among others, which we know has a horrible reputation now. And so I overdosed in my home when the kids were with a babysitter. Mm-hmm. And I was discovered, and I was in the ICU. And my ex put my children on a plane alone at the ages of 3 and 5 back to Texas. Now I'm on a journey, and there's one thing I would like professionals to understand when dealing with single mothers in particular in the military, especially anyone that's been injured. There is a physiological, spiritual, and emotional animal inside a mother that is only focused on protecting her child. Every decision I made at Lackland, at Dimphos, and at Bowling was always predicated by my concern for my children, because I would have given my life for them. If I would do it for my country, I would certainly do it for my children. And so all of the decisions I made from there on out, and actually until this day, but less so since they became adults about 3 years ago, my math was not decipherable to military clinicians or VA professionals, because they just haven't dealt with women. This isn't part of the norm yet. And so I immediately went down to Texas after getting out of the hospital to go to a homeless program in the community for veterans, and tried to do whatever I had to, the next right thing to get my sons back and to let them know I was not abandoning them, which was my utmost fear.
Mhm.
And so then I get there and more malfeasance at a VA. And I was still being medicated, and a doctor withheld a prescription from me for a reason that was untrue and not investigated. And I ended up, I was in with severe withdrawal from Effexor, alone in a hotel room, a mile from my sons who were being kept from me, and I overdosed a third time. But this time I was in a coma. I had to be rescued from the hotel room by emergency personnel who had to break down the window and crawl, this big dramatic scene. I don't know. I'm afraid to look at my medical records from that incident. But I know I was in a coma. And then I got out. I go to San Antonio for care, for a little longer term care. I come home. I'm still suicidal. So I go to an ER and I say, look, I'm suicidal. I know this is not who I am. I don't know why this is happening. And they were going to send me home. And I threatened to kill myself because I knew if I pushed the envelope, they would have to help me, which is what happened. Yeah. And they not committed me, but they had me go to a state hospital, which happened to be located right where my sons grew up outside of San Antonio. And there was a 2-week acute wing for community clients. And the doctor there said, you're mature, you have a significant fund of knowledge because of my mother's experiences. I think you're allergic to the medicine. Would you be willing to stay and come off? And I did. And that saved my life right there. Then I go, so now we're continuing, right, with this unsolved murder. My fears, my sons their grandparents are from outside of San Antonio, near where my perpetrator, he had a ranch near Lackland, which is, so I'm just frightened out of my gourd. I get a phone call from the journalist, another journalist. Did he ever mention Colonel Shu? Did my boss say anything? And I got scared and I called the grandmother and she would not cooperate. I was afraid for her welfare and my own. I called Air Force OSI. I called the FBI in San Antonio. I said, I'm getting this phone call. I don't know how to handle this. Could you help me? And they were going to meet with me. But I became so upset that I realized I need to go to the VA of all places. Let me go to the VA psychiatric ward because they'll understand my military story and I'll tell them what's happening. I get in the VA, Audie Murphy VA, and the doctor who's treating me and in charge of the psychiatric ward is the same doctor who treated me after my boss took her life. She's the same doctor who treated my boss when she was mentally ill and declining before she took her life. And she was also friends with Colonel Shu. Mm-hmm. I asked her, please recuse yourself from my care when she said that she thought I was schizophrenic because I was so afraid for my safety and my children's safety. I had signed a release to let her call the grandparents to try to broker some kind of peace and understanding, but instead she used that vulnerability and told them to keep the children away from me. I got home, I came home to an order of protection to keep me from my children. And then that started a 2.5-year court battle for my children, which I won. It turns out that the attorneys involved recognized the grandmother had some issues and was wanting to be a mother again. So they all worked together and returned the children to me. The children then tell me that a family member had slept in their beds routinely at night and taken their pictures while they were showering and naked at the ages of 9 and 11. Obviously, I was distraught for my sons, myself, because of what had already happened to me in the military. sexual trauma. And I took them to CPS, and now we're in a very small insular town with one corporation in town. And the person who harmed my children worked for that corporation. So when my children and I brought these allegations forward, the immediate fear was that the allegation was going to make that employee reflect poorly on this Christian corporation. They said that I had influenced my children, and their remarks had no merit. I knew I had manipulated my children, and I was being a responsible parent. So I decided, I had custody of them at that point, and I decided to visit folks in New York, my family, and we also visited a New York State child abuse investigator who interviewed my children, and he affirmed that he felt they had been abused, and he was concerned. So their stepfather and I got married during the family court battle to a lovely businessman who was quite kind and appreciated having children in his life. We got an attorney. We sought New York State family court protection and basically didn't get it. I was asked to turn the children over to the court, and I refused. Their stepfather was then threatened with civil action. I don't think they probably could carry it through, because my understanding is there's quite a bit of corruption in this particular county, and there was corruption in my case, but they threatened him with losing his businesses and, if you will, and good favor in the community if he cooperated with me anymore. So he divorced me without notice. He sent me divorce papers and my belongings in New York. And then the court said to me, when they asked me to turn the children over, I said no, and they put me in jail for the night. And then the next morning, the judge said, well, I understand why you're concerned. I would be too. If I promise to investigate this, will you put your children in voluntary foster care? And of course, I didn't have a choice at that point. An investigation didn't really happen. I was never spoken to or consulted. And I was called to court again. And my children were sent back to Texas. I was later told by their foster father, kicking and screaming, and put back in the hands of the perpetrator. That is the end of the immediate systemic abuses I went through. About, I want to say 6 months later, I was contacted by the VA that a clear and unmistakable error had been made, that I should have been paid more than double, going back to when I was medically retired in 2006. Now we're in 2011. My children are gone, and the amount of money was substantial, but it was only half of what I was going to need to fight back in Texas.
Wow.
In Texas, when the kids went back, they reset my custody case back 3 years, deleted the verdict, and lied and said that I held out myself as married to their stepfather when it wasn't in fact true. Complete fabrication. We even had a miscarriage. We had a family. We were running businesses, but I had no power. I had no way of holding them accountable. And that was the beginning of a 7-year separation from my children who were being neglected and abused. And then in 2011, I was contacted by Kirby Dick and Amy Ziering. I told them my story, and it turned out that my commander at Lackland, when I was assaulted, a general now, had been assigned to be the first sexual assault response director for the Pentagon. She went from Lackland to the Pentagon. When I was in DC, she was at the Pentagon, which I didn't know until recently. So I wasn't in the invisible war, but I helped inform it. And obviously they consider me part of the project, which I am very flattered by and appreciative of, because it's helped me to advocate. So once they contacted me, I was despondent I was probably hard to get out of bed for a year. But once they contacted me, the children have been taken. I found an opportunity to cycle across the country. I volunteered to do that because I said, well, if this is what we're going to do to me for my service, I'm going to use my public affairs training to make change. maybe that's what this is all about. And that's when Nancy Parrish from Protect Our Defenders contacted me, and we formed a bond, a friendship, and she became my lifeline for a number of years. And the rest is history.
Before we move on to advocacy, I want to ask one question. What role did your mental health treatment play?
The transmission is slow, so I don't know what the question was. Can you repeat the question?
No, can you?
It's the
hear me now?
connectivity.
Okay. Very strange. Hold
Okay,
on.
I can hear you now. Yep.
Sometimes I'm on Starlink and sometimes it just decides to move. Thanks, Elon. But anyway, okay. What role did your mental health treatment and diagnosis and all that play in them taking your children?
Initially, it didn't. The family court team, I'm an articulate person. I'm knowledgeable. I'm disciplined. I was responsible. I was cooperative.
Yep.
They didn't think it was an issue until they went to take the children after they reported the abuse. Then one of the statements in the courtroom, it was a pejorative, was that a new judge had come on board. The old judge, who was a huge ally of mine, he just really appreciated what I had been through and how I handled it. This new judge, unfortunately, didn't know me. I'm in New York. They have a warrant out for my arrest, to intimidate me, to not come to Texas, I'm sure. What was the question again? I kind of lost my track.
That's okay. Like, what role did the mental health treatment in your diagnosis?
Right. Okay. And so then I'll never forget the attorney. I'm on the phone representing myself during the hearing. Say to the judge that Miss Bushnell has been institutionalized, Your Honor.
Wow. Because
they had me stay in a state hospital that had this 2-week acute wing. So, I'll never forget this moment. I almost hesitate to share it, but I'm not one to wince at things that need to be said. Sitting in the library at the hospital next to Andrea Yates, it's a moment I'll never forget. That I have no opinion or judgment of her as a human being or her circumstances now that I know what psychiatric system does to people. Who knows what happened truly in her situation. But for me, it was just another nail in my back that I'm sitting next to a woman who has ended the lives of her children while I'm trying to do the complete opposite and being treated as if I'm not. So I was institutionalized according to the court. And so I guess the next significant piece to my psychiatric profile is that I end up kind of living on the road. I end up buying a house in Arizona, so I'm a drive every day. I'm just obsessed with my children's welfare. There was no psychological model that was going to help me not care about my children and lose sleep.
Right.
And so I got a house. I'm an advocate now. I'm all week I'm dealing with, I've got a mother calling me that her daughter's missing after reporting her ex-husband for rape at Fort Campbell. And of course I knew immediately that she was probably dead and she was murdered. I was helping with that case. Just living in my home, advocating, trying to do something constructive with this hell I've been put through and that my children are going through, which I did a lot of constructive things, but I had to get treatment. It just got to a point where I couldn't eat or function. My body was turning on itself. I have 70 food sensitivities now. And so I got treatment at one of the top trauma treatment facilities in the country, if not the world, which happened to be near my home. And so with all the problems I've had with VA psychiatric care, the kind of the bittersweet part to that is that I was able to call Senator Flake's office from inside a VA psych ward and the Trump hotline, and get them to, because now we've got a full movement going on, and I've already been in the media, and I got them to authorize paying for me to go to this civilian facility, which the VA doctors were not happy with. But I was fighting for my life. They had put me back on Cymbalta. And I said when they were discharging me, I am suicidal. Like, you're sending a suicidal woman home, and they didn't care. And that's when I started calling the patient advocate from the Phoenix VA, and they don't answer their phone. If you're in the psych ward, at least then, if you're in the psych ward and something happens and you're trying to call a patient advocate, they say to you, well, we'll get back to you in 5 days when we can. And you're locked in their ward. So that wasn't going to fly for me. And so I got on the phone. I got that blessing from community-based care. And that, again, was another fork in the road for me. And why now I am on a new chapter of advocacy where I think I've come up with some solutions that I want to present to the powers that be, and I'm working on. But at that facility, they GeneSight tested me, and I'll never forget getting that piece of paper that affirmed specifically some of the drugs I was on and my genetic predisposition to having the paradox effect, which means the medicine is going to do the opposite of what it's prescribed to do. And for me, it made me suicidal. If something, trazodone helps people sleep, it makes me anxious. Right. So it's just been an existential journey for me, and personal growth. I don't think I necessarily needed it, but then I needed it once I was bombarded with all this. Yeah. And I had to just start my life over in 2019, which is what I've done. I went into serious recovery, which has, again, changed my life. And, there's so much that I could say. There's so much that I've witnessed in the movement, just on so many different levels. And I'm still concerned for our active duty. And I guess this takes me to the point I wanted to make, that, you were talking about you wanting to stay when you were attacked because you hadn't done anything wrong. And I am at this point of the opinion that what is fair and right is to tell if and I get occasional calls. I used to get a lot more from folks under duress, but it is unrealistic if we really did a diagram of what a survivor is put through. And I'm going to say something that's a little controversial. Also, what an accused gets put through, right? Because the system's broken. True. So when your young person gets involved in one of these situations, even if you are wealthy and can afford, a high-powered attorney to represent your family and your loved one, the military has so much power. It's almost irrelevant. So between the herd mentality and retaliation and folks trying to cover their butts because they don't want to lose their careers in helping an MST survivor. We know right now in this movement that there are still lawyers being retaliated against. There are still sapper reps being retaliated against, and their careers being damaged for taking on that responsibility. Chaplains having issue. We know that this is all happening today. Yes. Now the law has recently been changed. The law that I vowed to not stop advocating until it was passed for fundamental reform, taking these cases outside of the chain of command. But this is going to take years, if not decades, to change the culture. Yeah. And I can't think of a reasonable reason to tell a young woman or a young man to sit and fight that battle powerlessly in an institution that has been in transit to change as being really forced to do the right thing. It just doesn't make common sense to me anymore. Yeah. I think that victims should focus immediately on their mental health, believe their feelings, believe they're being retaliated against, summon the help of a family member as their spokesperson immediately. Immediately, that family member and that victim should write their hometown congressional representative to apprise them of what's going on and be very candid about their mental health symptoms. because one of the only ways you can escape a retaliatory situation, either before or while it's happening, is through the mental health system. If you go to your doctor and you're honest about your fear and your insomnia and your inability to eat or your inability to go to work or perform, even in your intimate life, if you are honest, which most of us struggle with, but if you're honest about that, they will then have what they need to protect your health using the mechanisms they have. And you will have a chance now, because of much of the activism we've done and the reforms that have taken place, you'll now get benefits on some level. But I think that people, and it's with good intention, we are patriots. We have a mythological appreciation for the military that defies reason and practicality. And I would like people to get a little more sober that the military is not everything. A military career is not everything. It's not your whole life. It may end up being, a 20-year or 30-year adventure. But if we put this in perspective and we're mature, and I'm hoping that there are supervisors listening to me and commanders listening to me and health professionals and listening to what I'm saying. If look at this situation and just be honest with the victim. Because one thing about your story, Angela, that you shared, which I appreciated, was that your supervisor was not wrong when he told you what was going to happen if you told.
Truth. He told me the truth. Yeah.
And as the leading national advocate who's involved in many parts of this movement and has been, I can tell you that there is a lot of mystery still as to how they're going to fix this.
Yeah.
We're happy and proud of the accomplishments that have been made with new legislation. But the on the ground truth is it's going to take a really long time to fix this culture. And at this point, politically, I think there needs to be an intervention, an executive branch intervention. President Obama had mentioned getting involved. He had given a 2-year window for that was completely unrealistic and basically forgotten about. So I think it's taking far too long for these reforms, and we're not getting realistic information to victims. And for me, that's what I really hope to get out today by sharing this terrible story that I've never shared publicly, to just show people no human being, and definitely not a powerless, rankless young service member, is capable of sustaining or overcoming what you're put through. And the sooner you get your brain out of that environment into safety, the less likely you are to suffer lifelong health consequences. And at 50 years old, I just celebrated my 50th birthday the other day. I can look back now and say, if there was one thing I wish would have been done differently, it would have been that I got out, that I was realistic, that I understood that maybe immediately it was going to be uncomfortable for me and the boys, but in the long term, it was going to knock me out of the ability to work if I didn't get that brain out of that dysfunctional environment.
Yeah. And so, I want to sum up some things here. You said so much good stuff, and I have so many things to say. That, like, this is the impact of trauma in the military. Okay. You have a trauma, and then there's a snowball that starts to happen. Okay. You get a diagnosis, you get a bunch of medications. Probably you'll probably be put into therapy, an outpatient program, whatever, kind of when you were saying like seek mental health treatment, it like made me shudder inside, because I'm like, no, wait, because you should do so with informed consent.
That's why I said I'm going to contradict you from a different angle.
Okay. Tell me.
Because so one of the fears is I'm going to have a psychiatric record, right? Yes. Well, I think we're far enough. I'm pretty sure now, if you lose your clearance due to psychiatric reasons from an MST, we made it law that you can keep your clearance now. So the system is starting to recognize that it's normal to have psychiatric, if you will, issues after a trauma. So that doesn't need to be a career ender.
Yeah, but and that points to, I don't know, did you get a chance to watch Medicating Normal?
Oh, I did. Yeah.
Okay, so you have a trauma and you have a normal reaction to that. However, the military sees that as disorder. You're the one with the disorder, not the rapist, first of all. Secondly, But here's the problem. You have to get that documented somehow to prove that you were impacted by the assault. Okay. That ties to your disability benefits, that ties to the legal system. I don't like that that is placed in the hands of a psychiatrist. I don't like that.
No, but
Don't
here,
like that.
this is coming from one of my personal heroes, Sherman Gilliam.
I love him. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
He's now with National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. He said to me one day, I'm like talking to him. This was just about 3 years ago. Like, Sherman, I just, I don't know what was happening. It probably was Shadow McLean's death, I think. I said, I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. He said, Colleen, you cannot fix the system, which in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, yes, I can. Well, we're trying. But he's being realistic. He said, you can't fix the system. You've got to get to the business of saving lives. Yeah. So from that perspective, I promote active duty military. I'm not asking anyone to be dishonest or malinger. Yeah. I don't think it takes a lot once you've been raped and retaliated against on any level to not be okay.
Right.
But get your booty to the psychiatrist. I mean, every single symptom that happens, you write it down, you call, you make an appointment, you get over there. And again, while you're doing this, you're talking to hopefully a family member, because commanders will listen to family members. And that is my other rally cry, which is frustrating, but it's kind of a sign of the times that we have trouble getting our family members to understand the power they hold. They don't know, the average civilian doesn't necessarily understand that if you have a family member in the military, you, the family member, actually hold sway and have political power to protect that service member should something go wrong. As a matter of fact, if that service member asked a friend in their current life to make a call or try to advocate for them, if they're not a paid lawyer, the military won't speak to them in most cases. They'll say, are you the mother? Are you the father, the sister, the aunt, the uncle, a cousin? They want to see that, and perhaps there are legal reasons for this, I don't know, but definitely culturally, a family is analogous to what the military calls itself, a military family, because those are systems with patterns of behaviors and standard of conduct. And that's why they will engage with a parent.
Yes.
In addition to the account, because that parent can then go to the media and be heard, because they have the credibility to speak for their family member. If I had a bunch of money for a campaign, it would be a public campaign to address that, to educate the American public that they don't realize that when they don't get involved, they're kind of not doing their part as Americans, and not to mention family members. But here we are,
So to make that point, just to sum up what your whole story and mine, pretty much the same thing. You have a trauma, you get a diagnosis, you get medicated, you get medically retired. Some are getting out in personality disorder, which I think is completely crazy to me. That's a whole nother conversation we can't have right now. But then you're outside of the military, you're trying to find your way, you lose your children, you experience homelessness. I experienced homelessness for about 3 years. I know you have too. Then I got into drugs. Then I lost marriages. I lost relationships. I became a patient. That was my job. Like, I got a disability check, and my whole identity was around my trauma and PTS and getting treatment for that. And all I wanted was to feel better. Like, I just want to heal,
Right.
And anything I did was in that spirit. However, I was seeking help from the wrong system. Like, again, meds and inpatient psych wards are not reparative. They weren't for me. And that's who I work with now, is people that have been harmed by medications in the system. And it's almost like kicking the can down the road. You have this trauma, you're medicated, you can't even process it correctly. And then now you have medical trauma on top of it. And then you got to come off the meds, and then you got to heal. And then there's your stuff. It's still there. And now I got to work on it again. So like, I just delayed my healing by 15 years, and I was robbed of a healing process that should have happened a long time ago on my own terms. So that's how we are similar, is that at a certain point we said, enough, this is not working for me. So let's bridge the gap between realizing that, like, how did you wake up from that? And then how did you heal to a certain extent? It's ongoing for me also.
Well, I was sleeping in a storage unit because I needed to use my income to buy household goods. So I bought the household goods and slept on them in the storage unit so I could get an apartment. And I'll never forget going to the library and pulling out the DSM and reading the introduction and the history and learning that it was basically created actually to categorize war veterans and compensate them. And reading that for instance, with borderline personality disorder, which is a pejorative against women in my personal opinion, and many other professionals believe that, but it's stated right in the DSM that you are not to diagnose someone with a personality disorder while they're in the midst of an ongoing trauma. So we were in the midst of, I couldn't count the number of traumas from different angles. And it also says then not to diagnose it a significant window until that trauma has subsided. I don't feel my military trauma has ever stopped. So then I'm like, wow, isn't this a catch-22? You know, they're using this to kind of industrialize and herd victims. And yet they're not even following, if we're rules folks, discipline folks, structure folks, they're actually ignoring what the darn thing says. And then thank goodness, Congresswoman Spear came along and said, hey, what's with these 30,000 personality disorder diagnoses? I don't know that we got anywhere on that, but she at least attempted it to get some legislation, I think.
So let's clarify that for the audience really quick. If the military can get you out on a personality disorder, they don't have to pay your disability. So
because it's considered a pre-existing condition.
If you've served less than 3 years.
Right. So now at 31, my childhood trauma that I've overcome is the reason why I'm having trouble after I was raped and medicated with drugs I'm allergic to and retaliated at 3 different bases. I'm just.
And let's just say, and the similar things happen to me, is that when you're in the military, how many total years did you serve?
I always close to 9.
Okay, I served close to 7. Okay, when you serve that long in the military and you're you have that many awards and that many promotions and that many schools that you've gone to, you don't have a personality disorder, whatever that means. First of all,
right, you've demonstrated your functioning.
You wouldn't have lasted 9 years if you were personality disordered. They weed that out very, very soon. Okay, that would not have happened. So for them to use that to against a victim, to me, is sick, and that's like a weapon. That's not.
And again, for my message to anyone who's watching, again, and this is, this whole education, this has been such an education on democracy for me. I've never been involved in anything. I haven't written any legislation. I don't do office visits. I've actually was blacklisted there for a while and don't know why on Capitol Hill. But what I really would love to inspire the American public to understand that the military literally was not paying attention to their people. I mean, a basic thing like crime victim services, still we're struggling with. The idea that today, if a young woman is raped, there's not a mechanism to just buy 2 of her family members a plane ticket to get them to her in, within a short amount of time, so she would have their physical presence and they could see what she was going through and the environment she was in. I lost my train of thought again, but PTSD is definitely at play right now. But so help me out there.
Let's just shift back. Let's shift back to healing. Like, how did you figure this out?
Okay, so I have to give credit, and I'm going to say where I went, the Meadows in Wickenburg, Arizona. This is where also Harvey Weinstein, Tiger Woods, Kevin Spacey sought treatment, and it's in the media, so I don't feel uncomfortable sharing that. They have a separate campus for sexual issues, if you will, folks that need treatment for that. And the magic of Pia Melody, who is their matriarch, her book, I have it right here, which I think should be required reading for every young person. And I definitely have given this to many friends, but it's called Facing Codependence. It's different from Melody Beatty's work. It's a completely different approach. And it starts with childhood trauma, preconception to 17. And it teaches you what I call to learn and how to operate this way. Where do I end? Where do you begin? And what do we do with the space between us? So I had 2 years of treatment with them, inpatient in 2018-19, and then outpatient right after those experiences. I've had extensive exposure to their models and work. And I can now go into a social setting. One of my big triggers is just being in a group of people. Definitely a social group where I know everyone, we're all friends to different and varying degrees. But if something goes wrong, someone gets upset, someone gets offended, that's when my PTSD kicks in. But because I have recovery and treatment, now I can literally see how someone is acting, understand that generally if it's negative, they're acting according to a shame script. And then they're going to go ahead and try to self-preserve. And the group, I can watch a group of people now decide whether or not they are for a person in conflict or not, and whether they're going to align because of the treatment and the reading and the research I've done. And so now I'm on a new path to create a product that I think that instead of waiting for folks to have a nervous breakdown or offend, I think we need to start educating young people on the same material in a simplified format at a young age. And then let's say after basic training, and create a program that throughout their careers, this information is reiterated and changed for the level of responsibility someone might have. But I think this could potentially give the Pentagon, Admiral Milley, something to put their teeth in to transform the culture in a way that is non-pathologizing. And it actually prevents, it's true prevention. It would prevent perpetration of self and perpetration of others. So we're talking about sexual discrimination, gender bias, racism, just down or outright inappropriate conduct. When we teach people to care about themselves and we show them that their success in life begins with putting their own needs first, and sometimes editing, and sometimes that means leaving the military if you're not suited to be there, or if you now, as I said, if you've been harmed, I really think that's the ethical advice to give. But this is a new journey I'm on. I've pitched this idea to several folks, stakeholders who I respect greatly, and they have actually agreed to help me with this. I'm calling it iStrata right now, a personal digital command post. It's going to be multidimensional. It involves, and this is according to Admiral Milley's 2020 education and training vision, which says that they would like to focus on education, but experiential education. And so I think at this point in time is a perfect time for us to up our game when it comes to educating young people in the military about a very complicated set of human interactions in groups that not only is going to, I think, make it a safer workplace, but I actually think is compatible with combat for folks to have these skills. So my burden at this point is going to be to prove, demonstrate, and persuade and inspire the Pentagon to take a look at getting involved in the relationship side of service members' lives and showing them that it is actually in alignment with the combat ethos, the mission, because to think well, to think strategically and defensively, to take good care of your military asset. These are all things that are in line with the military culture and mission. But sometimes it just takes one person to connect the dots and serve up the solution. And sometimes it works. And we've seen that in our movement. This is a grassroots movement. It's a survivor-led movement, always has been and always will be, thanks to Nancy Parrish and her ethics. But, and I'll end my explanation of that idea with this, which is, if you think you have a solution, focus on that and get yourself heard. You know, don't underestimate your knowledge. If you're active duty right now, you may be seeing something that an officer wouldn't see or understand. That is part of a solution. Communicate it somehow in a respectful manner. And please, please be careful when you use social media to speak out in your active duty. That's another major concern I have right now. I'm worried about people's welfare. Certainly most people that speak out do not get physically harmed, but it happens.
Yeah.
And this is why I say, use your congressional representatives, contact them, use your therapist, get a lawyer, get your family to help you, share this video with them, but try not to harm yourself by trying to help yourself, and try not, look, there's a movement now. There wasn't a movement for my generation and decades before. So now if you tell and you call your congressman or the media, they know about this. So getting on TikTok or Facebook or YouTube to cry out and to emote, number one, it could put you in danger. It could have long-term consequences on your health. And honestly, it doesn't help, not to take anything away from someone who's a crime victim. God knows, I'm probably, because I am one of us, I can say this and others maybe can't, but don't be the hero while you're in uniform. The heroes were everywhere. Trust me, we're locked in our houses with health issues, but we're on our laptops, we're on the phone, and we're traveling to conferences, and we're working together. And that's why we were able to protect our defenders, specifically was able to champion 50 legislative reforms with Senator Gillibrand and Congresswoman Spear over the last 10 or plus years. Please understand that it's appealing to want to speak out and become an activist and an advocate. And there's always time for folks to learn how to do that, but to do that effectively and safely and ethically, and also not harm the regard for women in service, which if you know, you've really got to think deep before you get in front of that camera and emote. There are organizations you can turn to, Protect Our Defenders, the Service Members Legal Defense Network. Now, because of all the awareness, there's the American Legion, there's AMVETS, they're amazing. AMVETS is just on fire right now. The FW, you know, I'm not sure about how effective they are at dealing with this issue, but there are so many other options than getting on social media to emote. And then there are activists all over social media. So if you post, I need help, I have been attacked in the military, you're going to find somebody on Facebook who's older, retired, and probably an activist to talk to you on the phone and help keep you safe and maintain your integrity and actually constructively problem solve whatever it is that's in front of you that day.
Yeah.
So
really good advice. Thank you so much for sharing all that. So we're coming up on 90 minutes, but I could talk to you all day. I know. Yep. So let's just end about After Action. Can you talk about the PBS special coming up, part of the series of After? Tell us about it.
Well, Stacy Pearsall and I went to the Defense Information School together. She doesn't remember me, but Stacy has been through several combat situations, bomb explosions and stuff. She has traumatic brain injury. She's just an absolutely amazing American. She's a Purple Heart recipient and a combat photographer, and she was selected to host with director Don Godish this PBS series. So I don't think there's another female veteran that has done what she's doing. And there are 6 episodes. The first one is 3 men from 3 different wars. The next one, I believe, is on veterans who were immigrant status on their struggles. Another one is on people who are training new recruits. I don't have all of them committed to memory, but the MST episode is called Her Silence. And I was interviewed along with Connie Osher, who was a Vietnam era veteran, an MST survivor, and Stephanie Gaddis, who is the founder of Pink Berets. So I don't know exactly what they cherry picked and put into a show. We said a lot, but I know that it is a beautiful, it's a beautiful platform. I really hope that they take Stacy on for some more seasons. I think the public wants to know where we're at today. I think we're, they need credible information, and they need it to be personally explained in an intimate manner. And that's what Stacy pulls off in this series.
Amazing. And so, yeah, everybody in the audience, it airs on January 9th. So check your local listings for PBS, and you can do that by going to pbs.org, put in your zip code and search for After Action. It'll pop right up. You can watch the previous episodes and then catch the live on January 9th. Absolutely.
And on the app. The app is the easiest way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what should we end on? Like, do you have any words of wisdom, any last thoughts? Like, I mean, we talked about so many times, we could talk for a whole week about this stuff. There's so many overlapping.
If anyone's interested in knowing more about how the DSM is constructed, I recommend the book, They Say You're Crazy, How America's Most Powerful Psychiatrists Decide Who's Crazy and Who's Not. That was written by my mentor, who passed away this year, sadly, Dr. Paula Joan Kaplan. She was a Harvard research psychologist. She's one of the reasons I survived. And I did want to make one last mention. I was contacted by Carrie Godwin's father this morning, and he sent his blessings to us for this discussion. Gary Noling. Carrie was an MST survivor, and she ended up dying a few days after she got out from an overdose or an interaction between Zoloft and alcohol. So I told Gary that he was on my mind today, and that I would mention Carrie's name. She just, I don't know what birthday, but her birthday just passed on January 2nd, which was my 50th. So he contacted me, and he's definitely on my mind. And everyone who's lost a loved one to this scourge, please know, the word survivor is thrown around, but please understand that most of us know that not everyone survived. And your loved one is still a reason why we're continuing to speak out.
Yeah, it's a really good way to end. Yeah. So thank you everybody for watching. Colleen, if somebody wants to get in touch with you or they want to learn more about you, where do they go?
They can go to the Me Too Military Movement page on Facebook, message me there, colleen.bushnell.private@gmail.com. Or on LinkedIn, the best ways to contact me.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I know that was intense, and we're both going to need to
we all know
that's heavy. It's heavy stuff. It's like our whole lives, our whole lives.
It's an untellable story is what I call it.
We've both been through hell and back. I mean, and we're extremely strong and resilient women for staying alive when we didn't want to and fighting for others with our pain. Like, I think I can't do it any other way. Like, that's
all I had.
So yeah, we're made of the same stuff. So I thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
Can't wait to watch it live. Just keep going. May the wind always be at your back.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
See you later. Bye-bye.